Well, good evening, and welcome to the 5th Annual American Dream Reconsidered Conference. And today's panel, The Struggle Continues, the Fight for LGBTQ plus rights. I would like to thank Roosevelt University President Emeritus, Dr. Charles Middleton, whom I hear this is his birthday. I won't mention what number, but it is his birthday. So happy birthday, Chuck. And Dr. John Geary for their generous financial support, which helped make this panel possible. Transgender rights are one of the primary battles in the country's ongoing struggle to secure and expand the rights of all Americans. And we're lucky to have with us today several panelists who are actively engaged in that fight. Although we as a nation have made great strides, there are still countless challenges, particularly for the LGBTQ plus community. I look forward to hearing what these activists have to say about the history of the movement and our moment. I am sure they will have many ideas about how we can create a safe and secure space for the community and how we can engage on local, state, and national levels to continue to pursue better protection, not just for the LGBTQ community, but for all Americans. Now, to introduce the panel, I will now turn the screen over to our moderator, Professor C. Riley Snorton of the University of Chicago. He's a distinguished scholar who has written with great insight and humanity about LGBTQ rights and struggles, including his book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, which won the Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Nonfiction. Professor Norton.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening's panel. My name is C. Riley Snorton, and I'm Professor of English and Gender and Sexuality at the University of Chicago. My research focuses on Black, queer, and trans history and cultural production. And tonight, it is my pleasure to serve as a moderator for our esteemed panelists, who I will introduce in alphabetical order. Camilla B. Taylor is a director of constitutional litigation for Lambda Legal, the oldest and largest national legal organization committed to achieving full recognition of the civil rights of all lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, transgender people, and people with HIV. She spearheads much of Lambda Legal's litigation challenging the Trump-Pence administration's assault on LGBT rights. From 2011 through 2015, Taylor was the National Marriage Project Director at Lambda Legal. In 2015, the Marriage Project concluded its work as a result of victory in the consolidated cases titled Obergefell versus Hodges, a landmark Supreme Court decision that determined the fundamental right to marry as guaranteed to same-sex couples under due process and equal protection clauses of the United States Constitution. This decision struck down all laws banning same-sex couples from marriage in the United States and territories. Prior to joining Lambda Legal, Taylor was a staff attorney with the Criminal Appeals Bureau of the Legal Aid Society of New York City and a litigation associate with Sherman and Sterling. Taylor received her JD from Columbia Law School and her BA from Yale College. She's taught LGBT law at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law and the University of Chicago Law School, is a fellow of the American Bar Foundation, and serves as the American Constitution Society Chicago Chapter Board of Advisors. Modesto Tico Valle is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center on Halsted, the most comprehensive community center in the Midwest dedicated to advancing community and securing the health and well-being of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community in Chicago. A native of Chicago, Valle is a longtime community activist and organizer. He founded the Chicago Chapter Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt in 1990 and was instrumental in bringing the AIDS Memorial Quilt to the National Mall in 1996. He served as both a volunteer and staff member at a number of Chicago area nonprofits, including Chicago House, Test Positive Awareness Network, and Open Hand Chicago, where he served as the organization's first volunteer services director. Valle attended DePaul University and Notre Dame Seminary School. In addition, he holds certificates in nonprofit management from Harvard Business School and Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. He was recently appointed to the Centerlink Board of Directors and has served on the board of the NAMES Project Foundation, Equality Education Project, City of Chicago LGBT Health Council, Illinois Violence Prevention Authority Board, City of Chicago Employment Task Force, to name a few. In recognition of his work, Valle has been named Chicagoan of the Year by Chicago Magazine, inducted into the Chicago Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame. He has been honored by the National Names Project Foundation and the Norman Bobbins Leadership Award, and has received a Red Ribbon Leadership Award from the state of Illinois. LaSaia Wade is an open Afro-Puerto Rican indigenous trans woman. She is the founder of the Tennessee Trans Journey Project, TNTA, a member of the Trans Liberation Collective, and director of Brave Space Alliance. Recently, she was honored at the Chicago LGBTQA Black History Recognitions Ceremony and is the first trans woman in Illinois history to be honored in Women's History Month for the work she does community organizing and for her other work. LaSaia graduated in 2012 with an MBA in business management from Murfreesboro, Tennessee State University. She has 10 plus years of experience in organizing and advocacy work with Black, Indigenous, trans, and gender nonconforming people around the world. She's acted as a central organizer for the Trans Liberation Collective Chicago, the largest march for trans rights in Midwestern history, and is a leader in the Midwest ballroom community, hailing from the international legendary house of Prodigy. Thank you all so much for the work you do and for your willingness to be in conversation with us and each other this evening. Our aim tonight is to discuss the context and conditions for working toward queer and trans liberation now and historically. So I'd like to start with a first question. So I'd like to begin by asking you all to talk a bit about what you see as the context for the work that you do today. What are the unique challenges of doing this work at this time? What are the recent victories that invigorate you? What do you see as areas of possibility?
So I'll be happy to start. This is Tico from Center on Halsted. COVID has really impacted our community. The mission of the center is very much about building community, being the catalyst for change, and serving a very marginalized community. And so when we see the civil unrest in our city, and we also are confronted with an unstable administration in the White House, we often forget that the people most marginalized that we're seeing at the center, the homeless, our seniors, are not afforded the opportunities of equity and inclusiveness in this movement of shelter in place, of affordable housing, employment, and so much more. And so our work in terms of building community has really taken on a new shape, a new form during this time, and will continue to evolve in the months to come.
I'm happy to go next if you'd like. I think we're in a very, very stressful and challenging time, obviously. We are under assault from the Trump administration in a number of different ways. But it's not just the LGBT community that's being targeted, it's people of color, it's anyone in need of reproductive health care, anyone in need of gender affirming health care, immigrants, anyone who's non-Christian. There are all sorts of intersectional identities, and LGBT people who also share one of those identities are particularly marginalized and vulnerable. And among the assaults that we're experiencing are regulations that are designed to invite or require discrimination against LGBT people. And I'll mention just one of them because Tico has very bravely stood up to take a stand against this particular regulation. And because of Tico's declaration and the work of other community centers for LGBT people around the country and healthcare providers, we were successful in getting this particular regulation halted, stopped. An injunction was put in place so that it cannot take effect. And our hope is that it never does. But this regulation required all healthcare providers to authorize their staff to refuse to treat transgender people if the staff has a religious objection to providing services to trans people. The regulation said that a healthcare provider could not ask a staff member if they had such a religious objection in advance. There was no emergency exception or requirement that the staff person actually tell the healthcare provider that they were refusing to provide care. So it made it quite possible that someone could bleed out in an emergency room, or a person experiencing an ectopic pregnancy could be dumped out of an ambulance because the ambulance workers didn't want to treat that person. And the Trump administration said that the ambulance service had to allow this, and the hospital had to allow that, or they would lose all of their federal funding. So it was a huge cut, and it made the discrimination that transgender people face every day that much worse. And it was thanks to a number of very brave people that we actually managed to get it stopped. So even as we're experiencing a pandemic, even as we are going through a national reckoning on race and police oppression and misconduct, we are experiencing attacks from our own government that are taking a great deal of resources and are causing additional stressors in the community.
Oh, that's a lot, right? And I see and I deal with all of this every day. But also on the other end, you see Black and brown people organizing together on the ground. You see communities coming together to actually build survival tactics for each other. You see how most trans or gender nonconforming people have been surviving before this. Now we're surviving together during this, right? So it's a lot of double-edged swords that are happening right now. Smaller organizations that have been doing the ground on the work are getting more recognized in this moment because now they're able to do the work effectively than most organizations are. Now you're also seeing organizations that were never ready for this, that proclaimed they were doing work, never were doing work before this, right? So we're seeing a lot of cookies crumble in good ways in these particular moments as well. So, and we're also seeing the people that we were saying are sheroes, our heroes, or people on the ground are actually getting recognized for the work that they are doing as well right now. So the people are always going to come up during these particular moments. It's how are we going to come up? And that's where I worry about most, is because explicitly here in Chicago, we had Black and brown people going against each other in a climate of a pandemic and a political atom bomb is the best I can place it, that were happening. And how did we bridge that gap? Right? How are we supposed to bridge that gap when a lot of people are being hurt on the ground? So these are the particular things where I weary at, where Black and brown, trans, and gender nonconforming people actually are not able to reach each other during this particular climate because our people are fighting each other. So it's a lot of back ends as well that we need to be looking out for as well.
I agree, LaSaia. I think there's finally hope for systemic change. And I think this time we're going to see it, and we need to continue to march and fight and make sure people's voices are heard, not just people being at the table, but that their voices are heard. And I think that one of the things that we have been fighting for so many years is, our own administration's changing it and their own platform and priorities. So right now we are the priority. And we hope that we are able to create change by voting in November, but we must maintain and push and fight to keep our agenda moving forward.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate all of the intersectional identifications that have been named, right? So this isn't, when we're talking about gender, sexual, and trans justice movements, we also and always know that that has a different impact if you are Black or brown, if you're an elder, if you are a person who is experiencing housing instability. I'm curious to kind of pull on the thread that I was hearing across the panelists about this table, about who we think is at the table, who may still not be at the table, and how do we make sure to amplify the voices of those who are not usually heard.
You know, to be honest, I don't know who's at the table. Every time we think that we get to a table, it's another table to gotta get to, and then there's more people at a different table that is splits into a web of different types of tables. So they don't do this, but they do this over here. Trust me, as a person that has been that has like took an organization from the ground up, we're still trying to figure out the doors to actually go through. Right? I've been told by multitudes of different reasons of why we don't get particular types of funding. And one of the ones that hurt us the most, it came from our own city and state, was the reason why we didn't get it is because I am a Black transgender non-conforming person that was in leadership. And that was written on paper, right? So these particular things, we don't know who's all grading these grants, or we don't know who's sitting at the table to hold these particular people accountable, or how to hold these particular people accountable, because there's so many layers, right? And then we got to cut off the head, the body still is moving. We got the head off, but why is the body still moving? So there's many different pieces that we have to figure out what it looks like. But hopefully, as we continue to fight, people continue to fight on their ends to change these particular things. But until right now, we still got the body moving while we're trying to cut off the head. So
yeah, I agree. You know, there are many priorities, so it doesn't. You know, it's who is at the table. But I do believe that because we are a diverse community, if we approach this work through the lens of social justice, we all win, right? No one gets left behind. And that's what I strive for. Not that we are competing against each other, but that we work towards social justice to lift us all as one in the end.
And I love the optimism, LaSaia, that you expressed in the beginning about the good things that are happening. And I'm also really struck by the parallel. Roosevelt University's founding was one of radical inclusion and bravery. And those were the founding principles. And here we are having a discussion about the LGBT movement and its possibilities. And this movement, the modern LGBT movement, owes its birth to a group of trans women of color who stood up against police misconduct and oppression. And this was in the context of it being criminal simply to be lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And of course, transgender people's rights were not even recognized in the slightest. And it was because of sodomy laws, criminal laws around the country, that stated that if you were in a relationship or engaged in sexual conduct that was consensual with another adult of the same sex, you could be charged and prosecuted. And the fact that gay people were presumed criminals allowed the police to harass them, to do bar raids, to prevent them from congregating, having even the most casual relationships. And it was the fact that people were brave and stood up for themselves and created what was later termed a riot, is one of the ways in which this community found its self-definition and the ability to go and fight for legal recognition and rights in so many different ways. So I do think that there's reason to be hopeful, in part because of the resilience of this community, the fact that this community survived the crucible of an epidemic of its own, when LGBT people formed families of choice because their own families abandoned them. And when they were fighting against stigma, as Tico was such a leader in that fight as well, and for science and resources, and against silence. And here we have to use those tools too, not just for LGBT equality, of course, but to end the scourge of racism that we are constantly seeing assault us on social media, and that there seems to be no accountability for. So I think we have reason to think that this time will be different. And Tico, I do agree with you.
Yeah,
that we can advance.
The irony that our movement started by Black trans women or gender nonconforming individuals, and yet they're the most invisible and the last to be recognized. And I think the more you do not fit into a box, that community, that population tends to be forgotten in the rights, because it's not wrapped up in a pretty bowl that legislators can say, oh yes, I can make that movement, I can make that policy, because it's not pretty for them. And I think that's why, we are seeing the civil unrest and the activism and grassroots, because people are finally tired and we must rise up.
Yeah, I think, moving alongside the lineage that's been named around trans femmes of color, and, if we think anything from Stonewall to the Compton cafeteria riots, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and AIDS organizing, we have a very storied history. And as a historian, I'm always interested in looking at the past, because I think it gives us survival strategies and tactics for now and for the future. So I'm curious to ask you all, what models, whether people, organizations, or movements, have been inspirational for the work that you've done and are currently doing?
Mary Jones and Lucy Hicks for me. And the reason why I say Mary Jones is right now, correct me if I'm wrong, Riley, is first Black trans woman in U.S. history to be documented, fighting for who she was. And it's the interconnection for me around what she said. It's not what she did, it's how she said it and what she said. I never had an issue with me dressing this way until you told me I had an issue with dressing this way. And a little back story on her is she stole $99, which was worth $3,000 today, to escape slavery and also sex work. And was captured by slave catchers in New York, I believe. And then went up for jury around that. And when she was talking about, I never had an issue around dressing this way. She was talking about her Black people never had issues. That right there tells me that we had a place in Black culture before that was snatched away from us, our history and our knowledge of who we were. And also Lucy Hicks. Lucy Hicks she ran a brothel. She was married multiple times. And she told multiple people, like, I am a woman and you cannot stop me from being a woman. And it was important. These are Black trans women that were before Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. These are Black trans women that stood their ground in the midst of, oh, we will kill you motion, right? And wouldn't even blink twice about killing you. But also did amazing work for not only themselves, but also the people that they were around, women, men, and also everything in between. So them two are the two ground bases for BSA, and what we strive to be. We are not of the norm, and we don't want to be a part of the norm. So.
I grew up during the AIDS epidemic, and I remember going to the doctor when I was 22 years old and asking him, should I worry about this disease that they're talking about? And he said to me, oh, America will never allow a pandemic to take over, so don't worry about it. And I lost my father, I've lost partners, and I lost hundreds and hundreds of friends during that pandemic. And for me, the AIDS Memorial quilt gave me some hope to be able to grieve and to honor the lives that we lost. But that anger of making those 3x6 quilts the size of a grave that covered the fields of the Mall of Washington And not having a president acknowledge or even to say the word AIDS angered me and hundreds and thousands of people that took to the streets, very much of what's happening today, because we taught this nation how to take care of our own. We built an infrastructure in our cities that exists today and that really helped fuel the movement after Stonewall. And we lost a generation of people. And so for me, I still hang on to that movement, and it inspires me to see young people on the streets fighting and trying to create the change and moving forward that movement, because we still live with AIDS. People are still dying from AIDS. People are still being discriminated against AIDS. Our intersections are broad and diverse.
When I think of heroes, because I'm a lawyer, I can't help but think of Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because they built the precedents on which we relied to create the landmark decisions that now protect our community. So we cited to Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court in desegregating schools said that it didn't matter if resources were equal for Black students relative to white students, because the fact of segregation itself would be something that children would feel in their hearts and in their minds. And that quote has been meaningful for numerous judges thinking about whether it would be appropriate to have a separate but equal civil union institution just for same-sex couples, while still denying them access to marriage. And similarly, with respect to the landmarks that protect reproductive justice, those landmarks were then cited and relied upon in cases like Lawrence versus Texas, when the Supreme Court struck down criminal laws that criminalized sodomy, intimacy between people of the same sex. So if those landmarks that were created by the civil rights giants that came before us are eroded, then our doctrinal foundation goes too. And it's particularly important for us to recognize the connections between attacks in the courts on people of color, on voting rights, and on the ability of people of color to have equal access to things, because that impacts us too.
Thanks so much, everyone. I want to actually ask a question in a turn toward thinking a little bit more about trans and gender nonconforming people. You know, just this summer, there was another landmark Supreme Court decision that, in fact, is, at least to my knowledge, and Camilla, I'm going to ask you immediately to follow up on this, but to my knowledge, struck down discrimination in work and I hope also, I think, housing for trans and gender nonconforming folks. But I also want to think about, what does it mean to continuously grieve the losses of trans folks in this moment, and have this court case, and also be perhaps in a moment of unprecedented trans visibility. But first, let me ask Camilla to clarify if I've got some things wrong on that front, and then maybe we can open up to a full discussion about the kind of particular landscape for trans and gender nonconforming people in this moment.
Sure. So many of the victories for the LGBT community have been won through the courts and not through legislation. As a small minority, it's been very difficult for the LGBT community to advance civil rights measures through state and federal legislatures. And so as a result, still a minority of states have protection in state law against discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation and gender identity. There was, however, the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on sex. And since its passage, advocates have argued that if you discriminate against a trans person or a gay person in employment, that is a form of sex discrimination. Because if you are discriminating against a trans person because this person comes to work, as in the Bostock collected cases, one of the factual scenarios involved, and announces an intention to transition and a desire to be respected as in a manner consistent with their gender identity, and then they're fired, it's but for their gender, their sex, that they've experienced that kind of discrimination. And the Supreme Court this term agreed that it is a form of sex discrimination to terminate a transgender employee because she is transgender. And that was a huge victory because it means that existing federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of employment now should be understood everywhere in the country and in the territories to prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation as well, because that's a form of sex discrimination. Now, there are many federal statutes that prohibit discrimination based on sex, and we can expect that the same reasoning will be lifted into the Fair Housing Act and Title IX for educational contexts, and the Affordable Care Act's prohibition on sex discrimination. So there are a whole bunch of other ways in which this will be an extremely helpful decision.
Thanks so much for the clarification there. And I just want to, turn also to LaSaia and Tico, just to reflect on what we see as the kind of complexities of visibility and premature death. I think is perhaps the clearest way of describing experiences of many Black and Brown, particularly trans men, but also trans people, as we saw with Tony McDade and others in recent memory.
I'm 33 years old. Yes, I look 23 is okay. But it's a hard subject. Like, I'm trying slowly not to tear up right now, right? Because we just lost a young trans woman here from Chicago, Isabella. And we continue to lose. Within Gay Pride Month, we lost 10 in 1 month. And there was 2 every week. And it was 3 1 week, and it was 3 the next week. The numbers continue to grow every year. And even when I was younger, I wouldn't expect us to continue to grow this much. But as long as the visibility, some people say visibility is wonderful, right? And then you have other people that says visibility is death in particular ways, and it can be. And we have to acknowledge what that could possibly matter on certain people, and especially just living a day-to-day life. Most people just want to be left alone and continue just to work and move on every day. We live in a climate where a Black trans woman, a brown trans woman cannot get rest because the first thing they're worried about is, am I going to make it home? There's a statistic, people are saying that a Black trans woman lifespan is to the age of 35, right? But in the US, it's different, but also the death rate is higher than most places in the US and Brazil. Brazil is actually 35. At the age of a trans woman is the age of 35. But here, when it creaks slowly, I get to 35, I get more paranoid around, where am I going? Who's following me to the car? My name is out there a little bit more than most, so I have to be careful in the spaces that I go to, because I do run an organization, but also I'm a visible Black trans woman here in Chicago. So I could be struck as a target in a different manner than most people. When do I go stealth? When do I present as trans? So these particular things are a constant mind stake. Am I going to be okay when I step in this woman's bathroom? Is someone going to scream? If someone's going to clock me for walking down the street in a particular way? We live in that climate now. That now we have a president that is blatantly say, bust me upside my head. Me, I'm the type of girl, you bust me upside my head, you're going to catch a bullet or two. I'm going to protect myself in this particular climate. I have no other choice but to protect myself. And I tell that to all the trans people that I watch over and call me mother in the community, or call me a leader in the community. I figure out, how do we talk about self-defense in this climate? And that's my first go-to.
Yeah, visibility is a hard one. It is a double-edged sword. For some, like movie stars that are trans, they have a visibility, they're invited to the table, they have their priorities. And to the other extreme, we hear about trans Black women being killed, death, right? Those are the headlines, the extremes. Visibility is about who gets funded, who doesn't get funded. What is the priorities? We have an administration who is trying to erase that visibility, right? And so in some ways, visibility is also saying that the movement is alive and we're having these discussions. So yeah, there's a lot of thought that go through my head on that.
And when will my biggest thing is around education. When will we be able to educate our youth in a way of making everyone feel more comfortable talking about LGBT things? I've never had an issue with a child before I met their parent. And I want to be very clear on that. Stigma is real, and where learned traits come from is real as well. So if we are able to break that ground of like educating youth at an early age, and especially on the mass around particular things, we won't have to worry about particular issues or people knowing how to bake cookies in particular ways. So these particular things have been slowly taken away from school because of these particular, I feel uncomfortable on certain levels. So yeah.
Yeah, bigotry is taught at a very young age, isn't it? I always tell the story of a second grader who came to see the Ace Memorial quilt. And he came up to me and said, "What are these dates on this quilt?" And I said, "What do you think they are?" And he said, "Date of birth and date of death." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "It's not fun when you die on your birthday." And 3 hours later, that second grader was back at the quilt display with his parents to show his parents what he has seen today. We've got to change hearts and minds. And you're right, we do it at a very young age.
Yeah, this is the first year when the state of Illinois has mandated an LGBT inclusive curriculum, just a week of introducing to students the idea that LGBT people exist. And I have a now fifth grader, but last spring, fourth grader, who was in a class in Evanston. And Evanston is, as liberal and progressive as you can get, right? That was my assumption. And very diverse community. And a very surprising number of children were pulled out of class for that entire week because their parents didn't want them to experience an LGBT inclusive curriculum. So that was eye-opening. And I think it is probably a good thing that we are surfacing that and that we're now forced to acknowledge that there are some parents, because it's certainly not the fourth graders, who are very hostile.
We need to talk about that, right? We don't normally talk about like where is the real pandemic happening is actually at home, where the real the violence and the distortions of particular minds are really happening at home, where people that refuse to educate themselves. And I think it was very important, and especially as a Black person, being raised up in a household where my parents would say education is the only way to be able to get you to where you need to be going. And if you do not get educated, you will not go far. And then it was a double-edged sword when I became educated. I'm like, damn, I'm educated, but I'm also a Black trans woman, so I can't get hired on anywhere. So I'm like, what am I supposed to do? Now I'm an educated Black good girl with this particular type of language. No one wants to hire me because when I come in a particular space and I'm intelligent and I'm not a child and nothing to be played with, and I'm not an accessory that you can place on your wrist and say, oh, this is a Black trans woman we got having a space. That is the big issue in most of the times. And it becomes a big challenge.
Yeah, and education, housing, if you're afforded that. I think of all the Black and brown youth that come from the south side of Chicago traveling to the center to be their authentic self, thrown out of their homes, coming to the center to change into who they are and being and celebrating themselves here, but having to be returned back home where they're beaten, raped, they've dropped out of school, they have no jobs because it has not been afforded to them. That's why, your work on the South Side LaSaia is so important, that young people have something that is a beacon of hope.
Wow, this has been an incredible conversation, and I can't believe we've already been talking for 40 minutes. I want to ask a question that is really about the relationship between imagination and action. So I'm often thinking that we're not only inspired by the past, but we're also drawn toward the future that we want to create. So if I can just ask you all to speculate with us about what you think the world would look like, legally, socially, politically, how would it feel when queer and trans justice is fully realized? And then I'm going to begin to take some of the wonderful questions that we've received from our audience.
Him. He has a mother that is a trans woman. He has a father that's a trans masculine person. And he's being cultivated in a liberatory household where he can really feel as though that he can do whatever he wants and however he can do it, but also learning and understanding the stipulations around what he does as his gender right now, as a Black man or a Black male, whatever he decides that he wants to be. Older, then we will have them conversations, but changing his mindset and possibly change children's mindsets or hopefully adults' mindsets or the future's mindsets. I'm just, putting my little bleep in a pool full of, white t-shirts, and hopefully it spreads the way it needs to spread. But the Gen Z, you know what? I've been saying I need 40 acres and a mule. My mother been saying 40 acres and a mule. My grandmother been 40 acres and a mule. And Gen Z is like really saying, no, you're going to give me acres and a mule. There's no questions being asked. Hand it up on right now because we're not going nowhere. That is like, I am beyond excited for the future. And the future is not what I perceive it to be, is what the youth is going to turn it into. And I'm just here to help them lead it. That's it.
I see a future where Black and brown people no longer have to worry about police attacking them or beating them. I see a future where Black and brown, gender nonconforming, trans, and every alphabet of the world is at the table and is leading, and that is the majority and not the minority. Yeah, I hope to see that time.
I'd like to envision a time when people enjoy dignity and respect without government having oppressive systemic expectations or intrusions, and where each of our gender is simply something to celebrate but is otherwise irrelevant.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing those visions with us. And this actually cues right into some of the questions that the audience wants to invite you to respond to as well. A question from Sophia. Do you see any differences in this current movement from historical LGBTQ plus rights movements in terms of potential progress to be made? And if you want, I can repeat that last bit again. Okay, in terms of the potential progress to be made.
We're not so nice. or not nice at all. And, you know, I can speak from my own experience. I would talk to you just like I talk to the hood boy on the corner selling drugs, like I would talk to the person in the president's office the same way. I need my language to make sure that it is spread across the land, and how I said it that way, and I will continue to say it that way. We're not so nice. And especially when we are wanting to live. When you put a cat in the corner, cat's gonna fight their way out. And that is the motion that we're in right now. You're not gonna place me in the corner and think that I'm just gonna eat your breadcrumbs. We're not nice.
Yeah, our movement takes many approaches, and I think after 30 years of the AIDS epidemic, we have fallen into some complacency, and the movement turned to marriage equality. Well, marriage was not for everyone, it was for a select. And I think this time, if we want, history has proven itself that in order to create the change, sometimes there needs to be civil unrest. If you go, you're the historian, you probably can cite many opportunities when that has happened. And that's why I believe there will be some change this time.
Great, thank you. Another question for Camilla. How can we use local and state governments/courts to more quickly advance LGBTQ plus rights? I think of marriage equality, where several states provided this right long before the federal government, my home state, Iowa, included, and that's been fixed.
That's a great question. And it's also a good reminder that we have been here before. So we are experiencing a time when the federal judiciary is being stacked by the Trump administration in the Senate with a whole bunch of people who are very hostile to LGBT civil rights, among others. And it is becoming a more challenging struggle to win in federal court, which is not to say it's impossible. We've had Trump administration appointees who have handed us victories because people are just beginning to understand and to know trans people. And so in some of the most conservative courts in the country, we've had a stunning win, for example, on behalf of a trans student who was denied access to the appropriate bathroom in his high school. So that said, there was a time when sodomy laws had been upheld by the Supreme Court and the federal courts were really hostile to us. So we went state by state to state courts because some states have broader constitutional protections than the federal. And those were victories that paved the way eventually for federal court victories when we went back to the federal judiciary. But there are strategies that we can employ today because we've been here before as a movement.
Thanks so much. A question from Michaela, who writes, as a current student studying clinical psychology, how can I advocate for change and play a part in pursuing protection and equality for the LGBTQ community?
Well, there are certainly many opportunities through medical associations to make advances. And one of the things we've seen both with sexual orientation and gender identity is that it's made a huge difference when medical professionals have taken a stand that sexual orientation, for example, is not a disorder. To be gay, I should say, is not a disorder. And similarly, that gender dysphoria is something that exists and that people should have the ability to seek gender affirming care, healthcare. These were things that really changed everything in terms of the way that trans people could access healthcare. And there's all sorts of gatekeeping too in the medical profession in terms of thresholds and obstacles that are put up before trans people can access the care that they need. So medical professionals can both lead the way and also be a challenge. And it looks as though you'll have many opportunities to play a part in making things better.
Yes, that's great. And I think it also might serve as a response to a question from Elisa, who's interested in thinking about educational context in particular. Namely, in thinking about how we equip our children in elementary school, how do we think about that in light of the fact that perhaps staff and teachers are not having these discussions?
Yeah, you know, one of the things we often get calls here at the Center for trainings. Will you come and train our employees? Will you come train our staff? And we often push back and say, we would like to train your leadership first, because if you want to create the culture shift, it has to stop at the top, and then we can train the staff, because oftentimes we're finding leadership wanting to check a box, so I've done this training, but don't really believe in the training that we're bringing forth. And so we're fortunate to have near the center several affirming schools where we have parents very engaged in talking about LGBTQ and bringing their children to the center to play in the gymnasium. And so having the conversation, standing up, meeting with your administration really does make a difference.
Also, children don't care. They don't care. They don't care as much as you care. And the crazy thing about it is they're just trying to have fun. They don't care if it's a one-eyed purple people eater person monster that spits out candy and it flies and unicorns fall out. They don't care. We need to wrap our heads around that. They're just trying to have fun with other people. They don't see the things that we see unless we place them on them. And they acknowledge that you said that this was bad. You said that this was good. You said these particular things, and your children trust you enough to believe you in these particular ways. Talk about it at home. Have casual conversations. Watch about it on TV. That's not gross. We could constantly say, I had a conversation the other day with a friend of mine, and I am sick and tired of throwing their agenda in my face. This straight heteronormative mess. It's horrible for the children. It's horrible for the children. So it's the understanding, like the same concept. Flip it around. Like, have fun with it. LGBT people just want to live just like everyone else, and you don't never know. You might be bringing your child up in a hospital situation if you're just not talking about particular things, and they're not free to talk to you about what they're dealing with as well. So this all collides together.
We run we host a day camp here at the center for little ones, and I was going by one of the bathrooms one day when the children were in the bathroom, and our bathrooms are gender nonconforming, open to all, and this little boy says, "What does gender nonconforming mean?" Stumbles with the words, and the little girl said, "It means it doesn't matter. Just get in there and do your business." And I was like, I love this. This is like a third grader, you know? And so, yeah, I love those moments.
It's a beautiful.
I'm sorry. LaSaia, I interrupted you.
No, I just said it was a beautiful thing. That's all.
I think for people who are not so familiar, I don't know whether it's anti-bias training or whatever, there's a tendency to sexualize trans people and gay people and to assume that any sort of discussion of LGBT people is somehow inappropriate for children or sexual. And it's important just to reinforce that, no, kids can just grow up understanding that some families may have two moms, some families may have two dads, or some families may have, children grow up understanding a parent to be a dad, and then their parent is a mom, and that this is okay. And kids can get that. And I think there's a parallel too with respect to other marginalized groups who are often sexualized as a form of discrimination inappropriately in all sorts of other contexts. And, we've grown to deal with that in various ways. I think there's also a really troubling trend, though, of cases brought by anti-LGBT organizations on behalf of teachers who are refusing to use appropriate pronouns or names for trans students in the classroom. And the teachers are arguing, with the assistance of funding from these very significantly resourced anti-LGBT Christian groups, that they have a free speech right or a right of free exercise of religion to disrespect trans students in their classroom because they don't believe that there is such a thing as a transgender student. It's a sin against God. So 3 of those cases are proceeding through the courts right now. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to establish that no teacher has the right to disrespect a student in their classroom, and that the speech and expression belongs to the student, and that the student's identity deserves respect regardless, and it's a form of discrimination, and the school will be liable if the school allows that. But it's something to keep an eye on.
Also, trainings don't start and stop at one training. Just because you have one, you need multiple. Just because you have one, you need to update, because trainings update each year, every year. We do trainings as well at DSA, and we have multitudes of different trainings that is a 101, but also goes into a 102 and a 103 if you really want to get in-depth in conversation around breaking your biases or breaking your racism or breaking these particular chains of oppression that you didn't know that was oppressive to other people.
All amazing points, and we are nearly at the end of time. So what I want to do in these last couple of minutes is just restate and lift up the names of the organizations of the group of the people who are assembled to have this conversation with us today. Please learn more about Lambda Legal, Center on Halsted, and Brave Space Alliance. Learn, and if you are able, donate, contribute. And it has just been such a pleasure to hear you all speak about these issues and concerns at this moment. Thank you all so much for attending the event virtually. And thank you very much to the organizers and to Roosevelt University for allowing us the opportunity to gather to talk about these issues. The struggle absolutely continues. Have a great night.
Thank you.